Various science fair projects and sort of winning them and doing all these different things. And I go, well, what are you doing? How are you winning these science fair projects and sort of best in county such? And he said, well, I'm a board member of this one company, called KnowledgeContext. And the directive of this company is it's a grassroots. It's basically trying to instill life skills at a very young age in trying to educate them on how to use technology, what technology is. So the fact that he was asking a 10-year-old, Miguel was asking a 10-year-old to be a part of his company and direct it was pretty interesting. So for the last couple of years, I've been trying to sort of understand how I can help, and this is one mechanism of doing that. So I will turn it over to Miguel, who's recently published a book. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do is educate people on what he is trying to teach. So technology challenged. His background is various. It varies from NASA. He's a teaching professor at various schools. And he basically is coming in to teach you what knowledge context is. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. So how do you understand technology? How do you evaluate it once you understand it? And how do you take that knowledge and have it influence the decisions you make? I mean, like the small decisions, like what TV do you buy, or what kind of car? And then the big decisions, like do you use an experimental drug? And then really big decisions, like what sorts of technology does our company or our country or our society use? It all boils down to 3 points that I wanted to make today. I've got my little crib sheet here, and I've also got it large. So the 3 points that I'll make today, and everything else being just examples and stories, is 1, technology changes the world ever faster. I obviously don't need to make a strong case for that here. I mean, you live that. The second is that we can understand and evaluate technology. And by that I mean not just that the technological elite can understand on a technical level, but that society at large can understand enough about technology on a contextual level so that they can be involved, informed, consciously making decisions that have technology underlying them so that we can create this intentional future. And then the third point I'd make is that you can help society to guide technology. And that's really why I'm here. I was thinking, so here I'm coming to Google, what's the whole point? How should I design the talk? And the point is to evangelize. And I believe this is very important personally and societally, for our civilization even. So my intent is to present these ideas, hope that they resonate with you so that you say, yeah, this is important. Maybe these ideas are the way I've approached technology, and I would like our schools to use these same approaches, these same critical thinking approaches, so that all people eventually would be taking that same thoughtful approach. I'm starting off with this slide, a quote from Carl Sagan, because although the approach that we take to understanding technology has impact on personal levels, like what kind of car do I buy, I'm really taken by this conceptual, big picture, the context that Sagan places. So he says, it might be a familiar progression transpiring on many worlds. A planet evolves, planet formed, placidly revolves around a star, life slowly forms. A kaleidoscopic procession of creatures evolves. Intelligence emerges, which at least up to a point confers a normal survival value. And then technology is invented. In a flash, they create world-altering contrivances. Some planetary civilizations see their way through, place limits on what may and what must not be done, and safely pass through the time of perils. Others, not so lucky or so prudent, perish. You probably hear an echo with Bill Joy's "The Future Does Not Need Us," if any of you read that Wired article that made a big splash. Bill Joy was talking about genetic technology, nanotechnology, and robotics, saying that there's this cascading runaway developmental path which could very well destroy civilization. Well, Sagan was taking a similar approach, or taking a similar view, And I like to set this as the context for why do I even care about how we understand and evaluate technology. This is a depiction, actually also from a Carl Sagan series called Cosmos. This is a depiction of the Library of Alexandria, which at the time was the greatest repository of information ever. And actually for a long time after it was destroyed, it still held that title. And I bring this up because gathering information, allowing the distribution of information is not just a technology, but it's a driver of technological change. And at Google, you certainly have an appreciation for gathering technology or gathering information on it. This is I borrowed a New Yorker cartoon which turned the lions in facing screens, and then I put Google's book search beta on each of their screens. So you're creating a world in which it's ever easier to get information, to combine it. It's ever leading to ever faster technological change, and it makes it ever more important for us to consider, how do we guide that? What change do we want? Do we sit on the sidelines and let technology take some sort of fateful path? Or are we preparing society to think about what's good for me? What's good for my community? What's good for the environment? I'll give a quick background of the history of our relationship with technology, just so that we're starting from the same spot. If you go back about 2.6 million years to the first signs of stone tools, there were probably tools before then made out of wood, animal skins, but they've rotted away. So we know at least that our forebears were creating technology about 2.5 million years ago. And you'll notice something, that the pace of technological change has been accelerating. Obviously, there's some arbitrariness about what technologies I put on the table, but certainly, if you look at how dense things get just in the last 1,000 years, which I wasn't able to present other than a solid white block, there's this the clear sense, and of course we have it intuitively, that with microprocessors doubling in power every 18 months and hard drives doubling in capacity at least that fast, that the technological change is accelerating, and so it's becoming even more important for us to be able to understand how it's changing and how we'd like to direct that. Over this period of time, tools offered survival advantage, and so we used them. We showed our children. And certainly, those adept at using them flourished. If you had good eye-hand coordination so you could throw a rock, you had a better chance of your genes getting into the next generation. And that meant that generation after generation, humans co-evolved with technology, developing newer and better technology. It builds on itself. It's autocatalytic. So the more technology we have, the quicker we're able to develop new technology, and almost unfortunately, the faster the technology changes, the more we can become entranced by specific technology, looking at, say, computers and thinking, this is the only thing that is technology, instead of stepping back and looking for the patterns in the big picture. Clearly, it's part of our educational, career, political, and economic choices. And this is one place where it's important not to have a myopic view of technology, because if you recognize the technology as part of systems and protocols and pharmaceuticals, you'll see them underlying many of the major decisions we make. What do you decide to study in school, given your knowledge that fiber optics has made it inexpensive to move jobs to India or to China? Certainly that technology is influencing a decision you make in education, influencing a decision that you make in career. And it changes us. Starting back when humans good with tools had a better shot at procreating. The choo-choo train is from a story about how long ago, before we had mass transit, it was typical that people would marry and procreate within their own small village. Well, with trains, it was much easier to meet somebody from far away and spread our genes and create a greater diversity of genes. So it's actually, there's been a genetic modification of humans, given something as simple as the train. And in the 20th and 21st century, we're getting to the point of augmenting humans with technology, whether by direct genetic engineering or by implants, cochlear implants for improving hearing, and people talking about augmenting memory, augmenting processing power. There was a great, the the very back page of Wired magazine has artifacts from the future, and one of them had effectively a future Google where people walked around and they could see these bubbles popping over all the people that they walked by on the street, showing them multiple degrees of connections for how they related to those people. And of course, technology can exterminate us. Ever since the atomic bomb, we've been keenly aware that we have the ability to destroy ourselves. And then more recently with terrorism, this is smallpox on the right. Technology allows us to genetically modify smallpox, so it's immune to conventional treatments, and it gives us the ability to distribute it. This Marshall McLuhan quote so captures our relationship with technology. I don't know who discovered water, but it was not a fish. I see us as in a sea of technology. There's so much around us that it's very difficult for us to get a sense, to step outside of the fishbowl and look at technology and see the patterns. We are demanded to understand more and more about how to operate technology, how to interact with it, how to select it, and oftentimes it doesn't give us the luxury, and I hesitate to call it a luxury, but the opportunity to reflect, to step back and think about what is it we're doing? Is this the direction we want to create? Is this the future that we want to create? And sure enough, surrounded by technology, humans rarely discover it. There's been a push for years that we need to introduce students to computers earlier and earlier, and there's also a push back saying that they're not learning how to socialize. Well, this cartoon with an infant already learning how to use a computer, there's an extreme example. So we're at this stage where almost tacitly we assume that technology is computers and understanding equals operating. If you can get your children or your friends' children to learn how to operate a computer younger, then that must be a good thing. But understanding is not the same as operating, and computers are just one of many technologies. Now, it's not to denigrate operating computers. I studied electrical engineering and computer science, so if anything, I've got a vested interest in saying, hey, operating is good because that makes me more valuable. But I believe, in fact, that it's great to have the vocational skill, oftentimes very sophisticated, to use, program, design, test computers, but that vocational skill is very different from the critical thinking that we need. It's technological literacy is critical thinking and is looking beyond the trees to see the forest, or the example before that I mentioned, beyond the fishbowl to see the water. If computers are one tree, technology is the forest. And by stepping back, we're able to see the patterns that are going to predict what sorts of technologies and what sorts of costs and benefits we'll face in the future when technology may not even resemble computers, or computers are so hidden away that they go unseen. William Wolfe, the president of the National Academy of Engineering, had a quote that captures this well. There's a major difference between technological competence and technological literacy. Literacy is what everyone needs. Competence is what a few people need in order to do a job or make a living, and we need both. For fixing your car, for operating on a tumor, obviously you want great technical competence. For society, making choices about what they consume, how they vote, how they invest, what's legal, what's promoted, we need technological literacy. And actually, it's completely unrealistic to think that society in general could be technologically competent across all technologies. Nobody can be. Technology is invented ever faster than we can keep up with it. And every so often I'll look at the Nature Journal or Science just to get a good dose of humility. I look at the scientific advances, and I don't understand most of the words being used. The jargon is so specialized, it's well beyond me. And there are multiple fields in which it's well beyond me. So we do have people that specialize and understand specific technologies, and we have the opportunity to have many people, society at large, understand at a literacy level technology. So technological literacy is critical thinking, and I contrast literacy versus competency here. Literacy, understanding and evaluating, considering the big picture, a timeless skill, critical thinking, and competency, operating, designing, or fixing, knowing which buttons to push, specific to technologies, and it is a technical ability. So one complements the other. It's not a matter of saying one's better than the other or replaces it. Here's an example of where technological literacy is maybe much more important than technological competency, or at least not matched by it. If we're evaluating control versus freedom, and certainly after 9/11, we were faced with this balance of how much do we have technology monitor things to make sure that there is security, that terrorists do not repeat an attack, and how much do we give up of our civil liberties? There isn't any one answer for this. If I lived in Baghdad, I would certainly say control or security would be paramount. My freedom wouldn't feel that meaningful to me, given that I didn't dare step outside of my home, given the number of bombings, kidnappings, murders. And we make different choices along the way. So with technological literacy, we can recognize that control and freedom, or security and liberty, are often things that we trade off. And different technologies come along and allow us to make different trade-offs. So even though we cannot necessarily understand, but actually definitely cannot understand every technology that comes out, if we recognize some of the patterns that technologies as a whole from thousands of years ago allow us to make, or some of the patterns of what decisions they allow us to make, then we're better equipped to look at a new technology and say, okay, I like that technology because it gives me more of security or more of freedom, whatever it happens to be my primary value. So it's finding patterns that will be true for tomorrow's technology. If you're learning about a specific technology that oftentimes does not translate to other technologies, but this kind of thing, this translates, whether you're looking at radios, when Marconi first brought the first radio in the world over to England from Italy, and the customs agent asked him what it is. And Marconi said, it's a wireless. It allows you to use a telegraph even without stringing wires. Well, the customs agent, pretty sharp guy, smashed it, broke it into pieces. He recognized that this technology undermined the control of the British government. It could lead to even the overthrow of the government. Ironically, after Marconi went home and rebuilt it and built it better, came across and did not declare it, he formed the Marconi Radio Company, and his vision of what a radio was all about wasn't broadcasting to many people, it was the ability to communicate with ships offshore. Well, the British Navy found it so immensely valuable to be able to communicate with their ships offshore, they nationalized the Marconi Radio Company. So they went from seeing it as a threat to seeing it as immensely important. So here's this trade-off, control versus freedom, and it applies whether we're using the total information awareness, which has been renamed terrorist information awareness so that no one's really too worried about it looking into our lives, or radios, or even earlier technologies, and certainly future technologies. So we're looking for patterns that are transcending specific technologies. So how would you go about doing this? In this room and in this audience, there's probably a great deal of technical knowledge about various technologies, and over time, you've probably thought about, well, how do I look at technology? How do I evaluate it? We, unfortunately, are in a small minority. How do we get society to a point where, on a broad basis, we have people that are not making decisions out of fear or out of emotion without the intellectual understanding, but are making their choices based on a foundation of technological literacy? And one answer is that we teach young people in schools and we give them some sort of timeless tool, a strategy for understanding and evaluating technology. So that's my answer. Certainly you may come up with others, you may have heard of others that maybe even I don't know about. But my answer is, if we can teach young people to not just operate computers, but to think about and understand and evaluate technology, then we're on our way to spreading this awareness so that we can make informed, conscious choices about what sort of future we want. And every time I look back, when I think back to how much technology has changed our world in, say, the last 10,000 years, before agriculture, before we had cities and villages, we lived entirely different lives. In that period of time, that 10,000 years, the largest factor that I can see is different from then to now is technology. We have chosen various technologies to form cities, to form organizations, technologies that allow us to interact, share information, clearly as Google shares information. And so if we're going to look into the future, and everything's happening faster, so if we look into the future 50 years, rather than looking back 10,000, we can be rather assured that technology will continue to change our world. And if we want that change to be intentional, here's one way to approach it. So the nonprofit corporation that I'm a part of, KnowledgeContext, said, how do we teach young people to think about technology? Well, for starters, we don't know what technology they're going to be facing when they're adults. So what if we have them ask questions? What if we have them ask questions that are applicable whatever the technology is? And so we came up with these 9 questions. And I talked to folks at Oracle and IBM and Google and later Google, because we formed pretty young when Google was just coming about, and asked them, so you understand technology, what questions would you ask in order to understand and evaluate? So we start from the bottom left, asking this, what is technology? Clearly a question that you could ask 10,000 years ago. And then we ask, why do we use it? And it turns out that the reasons why you use technology have not been changing all that rapidly. Communication, survival, conflict and warfare, entertainment. And if you understand some of the reasons we use technology, when something new comes along, you have a tool for understanding it. Where does it come from? How does it work? And I'll go into these in more detail later. So these first 4 questions, what is technology, why do we use it, where does it come from, how does it work, form a foundation of identity. And certainly there's not the only way to approach it, but we thought it was useful to have them ask questions about what technology is, and based on that, to build an understanding of how it changes, and then how it changes us, and how we change it. There's a Simpsons cartoon. Actually, I had included it in the slides, and I thought, gosh, for copyright reasons, I certainly don't have the rights to use it. But if anybody watches the Simpsons cartoon series, Mo, the bartender, decides to go into the restaurant business, and so he buys a deep fryer off of an aircraft carrier, and it'll deep fry a buffalo in 40 seconds. Homer is distraught. He does not want to wait 40 seconds. Clearly, technology changes our expectations. It changes our perceptions of what's possible. With information available like CNN, Fox News, Al Jazeera, it changes our awareness of the world. That's a couple examples of number 6, how it changes us. How do we change it? Many different roles that we can play, not just inventing it, but managing, investing, questioning it, educating about technology. And once we have this foundation of identity and then change, the evaluation levels, what are its costs and benefits? And how do we evaluate it? So we have these 9 questions, and we call them ICE 9 because it's identity, change, and evaluation in 9 questions. And there's always somebody who says, have you read Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle? Here's the nod. Actually, we came up with ICE 9 before any of us had read Cat's Cradle. But in the story, it's a science fiction story about a technology that will allow water to freeze at high temperatures. This is a dangerous proposition, because if the water in our bodies froze, we would die. If the water in plants froze, most of them would die, at least all of our crops would. And if you allow this technology to get away, it could destroy all of life as we know it. So there's a case, a stellar case, for when you'd want to know more than just, what button do I push? How do I operate this technology? You would want to know, what are the costs and benefits? Based on what values would we decide to use it? When the United States was developing the atomic bomb towards the end of World War II, there was discussion at Los Alamos about whether the atomic explosion would cause a chain reaction causing all of the oxygen in the atmosphere to burn off. Would it actually get hot enough so that the burning would just spread and it would envelop the Earth in a little envelope of fire? Clearly that would be bad for not just our foes in World War II, but also for all living things. And the scientists debated about it. And finally, they came down to a decision that it was highly unlikely. But you have this case of a select group applying their values, which may not be your values, to decide whether the costs outweigh the benefits. The more we are able to educate people to understand technology and evaluate it, the more we can have society involved in those very questions, rather than a select elite making those choices. So given that we've got these 9 questions, which are rather timeless, we decided we needed a curriculum for the schools that would provide some answers. And the answers could be nearly as timeless. Certainly, they would not apply specifically to computers. Any way that we could answer one of these questions that applied only to one technology, we were not interested. So we came up with a curriculum, and we're trying to decide, where do we target that? And we decided that in middle schools, grades 5, 6, 7, 8, that's when young people are starting to make connections. They're understanding the interrelationships of history and science and the technologies that play with. So we said, that's where we're going to put it. And this is back in '98 when we first had the glimmer of an idea that we could teach how to understand any technology. And since then, we've not only provided this curriculum online for free, teachers can download it and use it, but it's been adapted by teachers, often unbeknownst to us, at the high school level and the college level. And I discovered one of the college users of our curriculum when we got a call asking, how do we get a hold of your book? Because I wrote a book called Technology Challenged. And I said, well, this is how, but how did you even hear about it? Because it's going to be printed in 2 months. And the person said, oh, I'm the director of new initiatives at this Becker College in Massachusetts. We downloaded your curriculum last year, adapted it for the community college level, and we've been teaching it ever since. So we just want the textbook to go along with it. So there are people out there who are thinking about, how do I get people to think about technology? How do I get that understanding, that evaluation? So to illustrate the ICE-9 questions, I figured we'd start with the North Korean radios. Here's the Earth at night, which is also a wonderful example of technology. If you went back 10,000 years, none of the lights would be there. There might be forest fires, but not all of these signs of civilization. And as we zoom over to the Eastern Hemisphere and then zoom in, you'll notice that there's apparently an island right next to Japan. Japan is down here, and the island inside the circle is the island of South Korea. It's not truly an island. It is actually connected to the mainland, but it's connected by North Korea, which has very limited technology. And so it does not light up at night, except for a few small points. Kind of a scary thing to see that. Well, it's scary if you understand that what's connected with that is a great deal of famine and repression. So I read this article in the New York Times about how little disposable radios are being smuggled into North Korea. And I thought, wow, what an incredible story, because it's this wonderful drama of people risking their lives to get radios in, and then people risking their lives to listen to them. Because unlike in the United States, you have to register your radios in North Korea. In the United States, we resist registering handguns because we're concerned, or some of us are concerned, that the government will come in and take away our guns, denying us of our Second Amendment privileges, I believe. Well, in North Korea, radios must be registered so the police can verify that they are tuned only to the North Korean station. If you are listening to Radio Free Asia or any other Western source, it's grounds for being taken away to a work camp. So the radios that you buy in North Korea have a fixed tuner. They actually don't have a tuner. You turn it on and it brings in the one station. And it is possible to buy a radio and bring it in, but the tuner has to be soldered in place. And in the middle of the night, the police can come to your door, demand to see your radios, and make sure that they are still tuned in place. And the prospect of being sent to a work camp for the next 5 or 10 years is pretty daunting. So what do people do? In South Korea, they've created disposable radios. They smuggle them in, and they're so small and cheap that people can listen to them for a day or two and then destroy them, bury them somewhere where they'll not be found. And that limits the risk that they'll be captured. So I thought, what if we applied the ICE-9 questions to understanding this? So that's what I've done. And actually, I've gone backwards because I like backwards. So we start with question 9. How do we evaluate it? And the whole point of what I'm going to do in the next 3 slides is just to say, what is this ICE-9 thing? This is an example of how it applies. So how do we evaluate it? The government of North Korea evaluates the radios in terms of their power. By promoting dissenting views, this technology is a threat to their control. Now, other people evaluate the radios based upon the values of liberty or freedom. Still, others might evaluate them economically. What's interesting is that different people can agree on everything but question 9. They can agree on technology's identity and change, and even what are the costs and benefits, and come to diametrically different conclusions as to whether it's a good technology or not. Recently, actually it was within 2 weeks, I've been trying to get the video for this, and I cannot find it on the net, other than streamed, and I couldn't, I wanted to capture it. Recently, the Taliban is experiencing a resurgence in Afghanistan, and they have been making videos and distributing the DVDs in town. So you wake up in the morning, and on your front step, there's a DVD, and it's got video of Mullah Omar, it's got video of Taliban firing rockets, and they're using this to promote their cause. Now, what makes this interesting is that the Taliban had made television and satellite dishes and video illegal in Afghanistan prior to the United States going in and overthrowing them. Why were these things illegal under their control? Because their value was very much the same as North Korea. It was of control versus liberty. And televisions and satellite dishes undermined their control. Now, the Taliban has always favored technology like Stinger missiles, AK-47 rifles, and pickup trucks, because those supported their power. And as things change, their values may stay the same, but their evaluation of a technology differs. So unless we understand how a person or an organization or a country evaluates technology, we may look at their choices and say, my goodness, they're dumb or they're stupid, when in fact they simply are employing different values. And it was Socrates, the Greek philosopher, who said the unexamined life is not worth living. So I paraphrase by saying unexamined values are not worth applying. We get people, especially students, middle schoolers, to think about what are my values. And we start off here with North Korean radios to apply it. So question 8, what are its costs and benefits? Like many technologies, radios offer trade-offs between such goals as control and freedom. In this situation, radios subvert control and promote freedom. In other situations, like in Rwanda, radios were used for control. Disc jockeys in Rwanda during the slaughter back in the mid-90s were broadcasting where there were refugees hiding, and they were directing these bands of killers with machetes to find the hiding civilians and actually to kill them. So there's a gruesome example of radios having a different cost and benefit. So the next 3 questions under change. How do we change it? Engineers design radios, activists distribute them, organizations fund them, and North Korean police hunt them. Clearly, there are lots of ways that we're influencing technology, and there are many more that we could list. Number 6, how does it change us? Independent news sources heard over the radios changed listeners' conception of reality. They discovered that starvation is not normal, and that their nation is not the world's most powerful. That North Korea receives food aid, and they're told that when they see these bags of rice marked USA, that's a sign of tribute, that a subservient United States of America is offering the more dominant North Korea. It's not explained that the United States has a good deal more power, or even that South Korea is a far greater economic powerhouse. So that knowledge is certainly changing the entire worldview of the people that are looking at these bags of rice. Question 5, how does it change? Electronic technologies in particular have become smaller and less expensive at an amazing rate, making disposable radios feasible. Certainly, if radios were large and expensive, you could not do this kind of thing. And the last 4 questions, the foundation. How does it work? Many technologies can be characterized as either centralized or distributed. Unlike a large transmitter, the radios are highly distributed, so many could fail or be destroyed without affecting the rest. So here's another case of how these patterns transcend technologies. I've got a slide later on that shows how 1,000 years ago in England, there were about 300 people for each power plant. And power plants in the 1100s were water wheels. Now, in England, there are 300,000 people per power plant, being mostly nuclear power plants, oil generators that you put in oil and get out electricity. So there's been this constant, they had a distributed system of 300 people per power plant 1,000 years ago. Now it's centralized, and you also see patterns of people putting solar cells on their roofs, which is highly distributed. So we're looking for patterns that are so broad that as new technologies come along, people can look at them and say, oh, I've seen that come up before. I understand some of that. Question 3, where does it come from? These radios came from specialization designed by experts in microelectronics. Broadcasting, however, was an accident. Radio was invented nearly a century ago for one-to-one conversations where telephone wires could not be run, the example of communicating with ships. Why do we use it? Communication is one of the oldest reasons we use technology, and it still drives such devices as radio, satellites, cell phones, email, and so on. And what is it? Radio is a tool to extend our abilities, allowing us to hear something from far away. But a physical radio that we can touch is just the tip of the iceberg. Out of sight of our systems of technical standards and networks of energy distribution and manufacturing just as important. Clearly, when you're using something like the internet, a lot of it's invisible. And not just invisible, but completely intangible. Just the protocols, the internet protocol. So in the next 15 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is step through the 9 questions and give a few more examples of what the pattern is. But the overall intent of the talk is showing that there are patterns that virtually anybody can understand about technology, and then suggest, welcome you to decide how you might get involved. And it could be working with young people, informing them about this. It could be getting curriculum into schools. It could be promoting online or through the media these concepts of how do we understand and evaluate technology so that people that are so fixated on how do I operate this new thing can get this more contextual view. Or it could even be working with KnowledgeContext, the nonprofit. So what I'll do is I'll step through a few examples. I had promised a story about Hawaiian bobtail squid in the description of the talk. So here it is. The Hawaiian bobtail squid survives by coming out at night. And it doesn't come out in the daylight because it would be eaten. Here's a picture of a Hawaiian bobtail squid. And the problem that it encounters is that on moonlit nights, especially with a full moon, it casts a shadow. And as it's floating along eating, predators may be below it watching for the shadow to pass. So what has the Hawaiian bobtail squid done? It's done something amazing. There's a bacteria called Vibrio fischeri, which is luminescent, but only when it's concentrated enough. So the Hawaiian bobtail squid ingests this bacteria, concentrates it. There's a quorum sensing, chemical signaling among the Vibrio fischeri that allow them to recognize when enough of them are together and they start glowing. The Hawaiian bobtail squid has evolved shutters, lenses, and filters so that that glowing bacteria is projected downward onto the sea floor in the same color and shape as the moon. So the predator looking up sees the moon, sees the moon, sees the moon, sees simulated moon, sees the moon as the Hawaiian bobtail squid floats by. And when I heard the story, I thought, this is absolutely amazing. Well, I thought, is this technology? And it occurred to me that there are some ways that we might say it's not. Well, it's not an external technology. It's not designed and it's not conscious. But certainly it is a way to manipulate our environment. And there's another story related to this, which is definitely external. There's a relative of the Vibrio fischeri, which are the Vibrio cholerae. They're the bacteria that cause cholera in humans and other animals. And what the Vibrio cholerae do is they live in water. When people drink contaminated water, they go into the stomach, and they have a really tough time of it because they're not adapted to the highly acidic environment that our natural eubacteria, the good bacteria, have evolved for. In fact, only 1 out of 1 million of them survive because of the intense stomach acids that we have. Because there are many, many of them, billions, maybe more, some of them survive and they attach themselves to the walls of our stomach. And then they do something clever. They inject a little bit of toxin into the stomach walls. That toxin is not enough to actually hurt us, but our reaction to the toxin is to try to flush it away. So our bodies start flushing lots and lots of liquid through the stomach, trying to knock off these bacteria. Well, what happens is the bacteria are holding for dear life onto the walls of the stomach, and all of our good bacteria that are used to sitting in the stomach juices are flushed out. Humans dehydrate, the stomach gets a very low acidity, and suddenly the environment is much nicer for Vibrio cholerae. Oftentimes humans die because of the dehydration unless you're given electrolytes and some means for staying hydrated. But this example, as gruesome as it is, shows the Vibrio cholerae changing their environment in order to get an environment that's far more suitable to them. you might say that they're doing something technological, but for my purposes, technology interests me when it's changing and when it's accelerating. And that's certainly something that's required if you're going to look, or what's required for that is that it be designed and conscious, because then we build on technology. So while those are interesting examples and certainly give us some outlying points to understand what are the limits of technology, it's not technology that I'm following. The technology I'm following is illustrated here, and we have an iceberg and a ship approaching it. Oftentimes we focus on the visible part of technology. Like I took an example of a personal digital assistant, but it could be anything. What's not visible below the surface is all of the things that connect to that technology. And the ship could easily run aground if it's unaware of techniques for use, applications, wireless network, maintenance infrastructure, migration plan, and so on. So you are very likely aware of all the elements of technology that tie in to the visible artifacts that we use, but a lot of people aren't. And in schools, we're teaching this way of looking at technology so that when they're making choices, they understand there's a lot more than meets the eye. In fact, technology are tools and systems and information. I'm wearing nano pants today. They have nano fibers in them. So what really works well is like with root beer or something bright, and it just sheets right off. Whenever I do pour root beer on my pants, the custodial group and wherever I am, make sure I'm not invited back. So I'm not going to pour root beer on. But these pants are a very primitive, early form of nanotechnology. It's just fibers that stand up, and the dimensions, the cross dimensions, not the length, are down in the several hundred nanometer scale. Well, the promise of nanotechnology, whether we reach it or not, is assemblers and matter compilers. So if we had something like a microwave oven that allowed us to download the designs for something from Napster, and then have it fabricated out of a feed of various different types of elements that came in, like we currently get water, gas, and electricity, then you could manufacture anything you wanted. And the reason I bring this up is because the third bullet of information, technology being almost synonymous with information would become pretty clear at that point, because you're not buying anything except for a design. In order to create whatever you want, the commodity is whatever's being fed into the back of your matter compiler. The interesting stuff is the design. Why do we use it? I'd mentioned that communication is a reason that we've used technology for a very long time. Here's an example going from scrolls to the printing press, the telegraph, the telephone. And then a photograph I took at the Smithsonian Museum. This fellow had a Bluetooth earpiece. And now they're pretty common, but back when I was at the Smithsonian, it was the first one that I'd seen. So I wanted to get a picture of him contrasting the statues in the background with this very new way to communicate. And we teach young people lots of the different reasons why we use technology, so they recognize them as new technologies come out. Where does it come from? It comes from a number of places. One of them is other tools. I just read a short analysis about YouTube and how come YouTube came about. And it was based, obviously, on other tools. It was based on cheap video hardware, making it easy to capture video, cheap video editing software, Web 2.0 and Web 2.0 being built on all sorts of other tools, both artifacts, protocols, software. The examples I have here, you see a fisherman down in Australia. It turns out that dense populations are rather important for technology. A long time ago, Australia and Tasmania, the small island that's currently just off of its shore, they were connected. And the technologies of fishing and needles and so on that were present on one were present on the other. As the ice caps melted and water rose, Tasmania was isolated, and they actually lost those technologies. For thousands of years, they did not fish. And archaeologists can tell that they had starvation during those years, so they certainly had the motivation to fish, but they didn't even think about fish as a food. They didn't have the technology for getting it, which raises the question of how could they lose the technology? The best explanation that I've read, actually this is from Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel, was that they had such a small population that they actually forgot the technology. That at some point, there were only one or two people who remembered how to create it, and somehow they passed away without passing it along. plan and accident. I represent that with Napoleon and the light bulb. Napoleon was wont to start wars, and in one of his wars, he discovered that the only source of graphite was in England, and England was unfortunately one of his opponents. So they lost their source of graphite, which was critical for pencils. Pencils were critical for the people that kept the books, all of the accounting that a government depends upon. So Napoleon said, as a national priority, I want to substitute for this pure source of graphite, which England controls. And there was a fellow, Lecomte, who discovered that you can take impure forms of graphite, mix it with clay, and create a very fine writing implement. And in fact, you can vary the amounts of clay and graphite so that you have different hardnesses. And now we have the pencils that have H and HB, like the number 2 pencils, that have different hardnesses because you have those mixtures of clay. So there was an intention, a plan to create a new technology. And the light bulb relates to an accident. Edison discovered that if you put a third wire into the light bulb, you can actually measure how much electricity is going through the filament. But he couldn't see why there was any use for this, so he patented it and moved on. And it was someone later on who figured out that this was actually a vacuum tube and allowed you to amplify signals, which led to the transistor, which led to the integrated circuit, and on from there. So it was actually an accidental discovery that brought us to semiconductor technology. The vehicle wheel it was patented rather recently, not thousands of years ago. And in that way, it was done as a stunt to show that our patent system is not working that well. In some ways, our patent system does work well, that it does give you the chance to invest in discovering a technology and then have the time to profit from it before copycats move in. But it also can give people the opportunity to just simply squat on ideas and not develop them. So we go into the various places that information comes from. Oh, and one other point on dense population. One reason real estate prices are expensive in Silicon Valley is because there's that benefit of dense population. There are people from Google and the other high techs and from Stanford and Berkeley, and it's that interaction, that sharing of ideas that's so valuable to companies. How does it work? Here are a few answers, patterns that answer the question, how does technology work? I mentioned that in the 11th century, in England, you had roughly 300 people for each power plant. And currently, in the 21st century in England, about 300,000 people for each power plant. There's certainly a centralization. And also that we can decentralize with computers. We've had centralization with mainframes, decentralization with PCs being everywhere, re-centralization with server farms, and there'll probably be continual cycles and fluctuations. So centralized versus distributed is one pattern in technology that transcends technologies. There's also repetition in layers. If you look at the example at the bottom left, we have silicon with impurities, semiconductors, being the foundation for making transistors, being a foundation for making logic gates, which are used to make microprocessors, on which we run machine languages, on which we run operating systems, on which we have application software. So we're able to operate or understand at one level without having to understand all the other levels. And an illustration of why this is good to know is that, say you're evaluating a technology, and it's a very complex technology. You may have to go to experts to find out what are the costs and benefits. Understanding that experts may specialize in one layer and not really understand the other layers gives you the caution that maybe they don't understand how interactions could lead to costs or benefits. So as we build up this pyramid, we're building on this understanding at the identity and change levels in order to understand the costs and the benefits, in order to understand how do we evaluate. There's an example of Sendabots, which is emergent behavior among lots of little robots. I believe this is from SRI. And control and feedback algorithms. I won't go into the details on these, but you may well recognize how these patterns underlie lots of different technologies. So this is the kind of thing that we can teach young people that will not become obsolete in 18 months or 36 months when the applications that they learn may become obsolete. But these are the patterns that will last throughout the rest of their lives. How does it change? There's the obvious example of computers becoming smaller, faster, more ubiquitous. These are four of the answers that we give in the book, which is actually aimed at adults and in the curriculum. necessity is mother and daughter. Sometimes there's the saying that invention is the mother, necessity is the mother of invention. You really need something, so you invent it. Oftentimes it's flipped around, that you have something, so you start looking for an application. The microprocessor was a case in point. Intel developed a microprocessor. It was supposed to go into a calculator. It turns out the microprocessor was far too expensive to go into these calculators that Busacom was trying to build. So Intel had this technology that they needed to find an application for, and they went off evangelizing. And it turns out that there are some good applications for microprocessors other than calculators. Advantage, compatibility, risk, visibility. And I'll get to that in the next slide. Autocatalysis, which is technology feeding off of itself to create new technologies, and evolution and memes. The whole meme concept that Richard Dawkins started. It's a fascinating way to look at how technology changes. So let's go into advantage, compatibility, risk, and visibility. From 1700 BC, there was this disk called the Phaistos disk or Phaistos disk, discovered on an island in the Mediterranean. And apparently it is the earliest example of printing, mass printing, because it had these 45 symbols which were repeated. But it never took off. It didn't take off like printing did in China, Korea, or in Europe with Gutenberg's printing press. And we look at these elements of advantage, compatibility, risk, and visibility to understand why the Phaistos disk did not take off. Why did it fail as a technology? Why did it not diffuse? And it did not have much of an advantage because few people back then could read, so there was no market for printing. There were no pocket-back books or pocketbooks. Compatibility, the people that controlled writing were in a very powerful position, so they did not really want a lot of other people to learn how to write or to distribute. That would undermine their position of power. There was risk. Casting multiples of 45 symbols and testing clay mixtures would require investment. And because there wasn't that much demand, that risk of investment really wasn't that justified. And finally, visibility. Carving symbols and pressing into the tablet was actually slower than a stylus. So if you were going into, say, a venture capital meeting with the Phaistos disk, 1700 BC, it might have been a pretty hard sell to get them to invest in it. And in fact, the venture capitalists from 3,700 years ago did not. How does it change us? 4 ways that it changes us. Methuselah's burden. Technology is allowing us to be healthier, live longer, and change a lot of the ways that we interact with our environment. How we change education, actually it changes crime levels. It turns out that there's this strong correlation between suicide rates and murder rates and lifespan. There are crime statistics in the Domesday Book from England, from actually the year 1100 and thereabouts. And it shows that murder rates were far, far higher than suicide rates. And over time, the murder rates dropped steadily and suicide rates increased steadily. They crossed somewhere in the 19th century, and it correlates very closely to lifespan. It seems that the longer we live, the less likely we're inclined to kill someone, and the more likely we're inclined to take our own lives. I don't know why that is, but it's one way that technology extending our lives and extending our health may affect a lot of things about society. This cartoon is an example of working up the pyramid about how technology allows us to do things that, well, actually the cartoon spoofs it, but technology does allow us to work at higher and higher intellectual levels and allow the technology to take care of many of the underlying routine measures. And I know we started a bit late. I'm going to step through the last few slides quickly so I can get to the finale and not delay the next talk that's coming up. We do have to stop for this cartoon. We're neither software nor hardware. We're your parents. Technology changes the way we look at things. And certainly here's this young kid who's used to hardware and software, and everything must fit into one category or the other, mustn't it? We change it in lots of different ways. Education is certainly a way that you can have a broad impact on changing technology. Costs and benefits is a picture from China, where a lot of our e-waste is sent for recycling. And this is a picture of a woman with a hammer about to knock the yoke off the back of a cathode ray tube. And if she's lucky, it will not implode and then explode, but simply crack easily so she can take the copper coil off of the back. Unfortunately, it can do that. It can explode, and it has lead on the inside. The lead protects us from the The electron beam is where we're looking at it, but it will get into water reservoirs wherever it's being broken up, in this case China, and it's a poison. How do we evaluate it? In the curriculum, actually in the book, we go around the world and we look at all these different examples, from the Yir-Yurant Aboriginals in Australia evaluating stone axes and canoes, to priests and water temples and small-scale agriculture, nuclear power, lots of different ways that our values come into play when we're deciding whether a technology is good or bad. We look at these different value systems. Here's an adaptation of a Far Side cartoon. This is not Gary Larson's title, it's my own caption. I don't care that we have only one technology. I vote that we understand and evaluate it before it's too late. Certainly now we have many technologies, and we're at the point where it's valuable to understand and evaluate. So the summary is, technology changes our world ever faster. We can understand and evaluate technology, and you can help society to guide technology. So my appeal to those of you who've been so kind to come is reflect on how you evaluate technology, and then share your approach with children and friends. Use technological literacy use technology to promote technological literacy. Use blogs, use whatever techniques you have for promoting this idea that's so important to us choosing an intentional future. Promote technological literacy curricula at schools, and, if you like, help KnowledgeContext, which is at knowledgecontext.org. If anyone's interested in talking with me afterwards, I'll be sticking around for lunch, and I thank you very much for coming to this presentation.